Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to make new friends and to also see some long-standing friends. So if ActionAid does anything wrong, you can blame Liam. That was all his responsibility. But it's a really great pleasure to be here. And it's important for ActionAid to start in this debate, as we have learned a lot on our experience on dealing with humanitarian crisis. First of all, we have been involved for many years in this process, and from the tsunami to Haitian earthquake to the Nepali earthquake and more recent responses in South Asia or in East Africa, a lot has evolved. And I would say that the change is not a change that is an intellectual self-decision to say, we ActionAid, we decided to change because it is an interesting moment to change. It's also because of our relationship with our partners. So lots of the conversation of localization comes from an intellectual exercise of analysis of our efficient impact of our response, but also come from the pushback that a farmers association in Nepal tell us, look, you cannot come here and start a new intervention without being led by us. Or a farmers movement in Nepal to say, look, the only way for you to reach out to those that are really affected by the earthquake is through us. Not even the government is reaching out there. So there is an element of a relationship, and that change on approach is not a change that started at the Humanitarian Summit. It's a change that starts in the relationship that ActionAid develops at each one of the communities that we work that are affected by disasters. So I will start by saying that we do have developed a signature for our response based on that relationship with communities and movements. Basically 3 things that have come out. Like the Haitian example is a good one. We started the process of responding to the Matthew hurricane last year. And we worked with a peasants organization called KPGA. I will not try to get the Creole name, which is very locally rooted. And basically, they have launched themselves the response. And more importantly, they have developed the criteria on how to identify the most affected people. They have developed the methodology to reach out to them. So therefore, working with them was just not a political decision. It's just obvious. It's the only way that we could actually reach out to those that the most affected ones. So we worked with them. They have established a women-led committees in each one of the communes, and they have developed the criteria, and they have planned and undertook the responsibility. So that kind of approach in one way devolves power and funding to the most vulnerable, but also shows a different way to deal with that. Because to be very honest with you, and I've been supervising ActionAid response in Haiti during the earthquake, what we see in many cases, these people that really coordinate the response, they are there from day 1. Actually, they are there from day -10. They live there. And what happens is that on the initial phase of a disaster, they are the ones coordinating everything until we arrive. And I'll be very critical here, but I think that's the reflection we need. When I mean we, is the boys on shores. The whole humanitarian community arrives and tends to actually push them away and start a new different intervention that instead of empowering local leadership, disempowers local leadership, lose the ability to focus the program to the needs of people, and actually contributes to a new cycle of exploitation and disenfranchisement, as opposed to build on that. So we have learned to work with those communities, and also with the most vulnerable women and the people that are affected, and also minorities and ethnicity minorities and others. So that's why we do call for a more localized international humanitarian system and locally led response. Our approach has been evolving quite a lot, also in terms of how you understand the local actors. It's not only a question of transferring money, like instead of ActionAid doing the response, the peasant organization does. It's about reframing the understanding of the people affected by disasters. We tend to see them as passive recipients of aid. So someone lost the house, we build a house. Someone doesn't have water, we deliver water. As opposed to see those people as rights holders that actually have the full possibility and capability to transform the power relations in that community. So another example from Haiti, now from earthquake times, we started working with a number of communities that were affected by the earthquake. And at some stage, instead of just ensuring that there would be water, and then there would be food, and then there would be provisional housing, we started building a movement with them that was called Genderblind, which means I on I in Creole, And that movement, what they have done was to create a platform of movements in Haiti that put out 50,000 people on the streets of Port-au-Prince to go to the parliament and say, you've got to change the law. Because if you don't change the law, it will be impossible for us to have the land that we need in the cities to build permanent houses. So there was a fundamental policy issue, but they were the agents of their own change. We're not just receiving aid, but they actually use the disruption that a disaster of that proportion creates in society to re-empower themselves as leaders of change. So that's why we do focus a lot, both in localizing, in working with social movements at local level, as well as to work with women's groups, which I'll tell more later. So our work is always framed by an international humanitarian system that has fundamental issues. So as you know, the UN agencies and 6 international federations have 80% of all humanitarian funding, and obviously the local and national NGOs and the women's rights organizations, and the women's organizations particularly, have almost none. So some data into that, just to say that currently only 0.4% of the aid in humanitarian aid is channeled to local and national actors. This imbalance is just like a fundamental symptom of a deficit of inclusiveness, diversity, and openness in a self-regulated international humanitarian system. As you know, it's a system that's very dominated by quite gender-blind, men-led, that's what we call them the boys on shorts, and as a classic term on development. And it's not only that it's unjust, it becomes very ineffective, because it's a system that tends to serve itself if we don't promote fundamental change. On the other hand, the leadership of women and women's organizations in the humanitarian system and response goes undervalued, unrecognized, and undermined. I'll give you one example from my own experience. Just after the Nepali earthquake, I went to the very epicenter and met this woman in one of the communities. She, first of all, was directly affected. Her house collapsed. She lost 2 of her children. At that very moment, she had not only to take care of the burial or the burning of her children, but also to provide food to her family, to the remaining alive members of her family, as well as to organize the community to find another way to have access to water because the pipes were disrupted. So this is the first respondent. Is a person that is on one hand affected, in the other hand is a leader that is immediately from the second one of a disaster increased her unpaid care work, because she has to take care of more people in a more difficult situation. She has become much more vulnerable to gender-based violence of many sorts, and she has a much increased responsibility. However, that's exactly the leadership that can ensure that the response will respond to her own needs. Because if anyone else is designing it, it will by definition exclude her own needs. So in the system, unfortunately, that's not working, in spite of all the agreements that we have done. For example, the OCHA financing tracking system tells that only 1.7% of the projects have targeted women and girls. Also, the capacity and knowledge of local women's organization is not being fully utilized, with only 1% of all funding to fragile states in 2015 and going to women's groups or government ministries of women. So there is a fundamental gap between the humanitarian system, rhetoric about gender and women's leadership, and the reality of the money. And that gap is one of the challenges that we have to address together. So let me move into a little bit of the opportunities for transformation. I think, of course, the first one has to do with the Grand Bargain. So you know it. We have all agreed on many important commitments. In the case of ActionAid, we believe that we can make a fundamental change in the lives of disaster-affected communities, challenging existing gender inequalities and creating more just and equal world for women. And that's beyond rhetoric. That's something that can be done. We have done it in many places. We have done it from tsunami response and ensuring that women fisher folks would remain close to their livelihoods as opposed to be pushed into the land and lose their land to touristic initiatives. We also have done that on our responses to drought recently to ensure that we have that leadership there. There is a huge opportunity, and the opportunity came from the commitments. The problem that we have is that we make lots of commitments, but we tend to leave them in Istanbul. And I think lots of those commitments, if you really look, to what extent have we, honestly, changed our practice from Istanbul to now? And how many emergencies we had since then until now, almost or just a year after those commitments? We have not yet changed. We have not yet created a possibility of collaboration and a fundamental system of incentives that would walk the talk of the rhetoric commitments that we all have made. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to actually use it now to really create a new understanding in which the women and girls are recognized as change agents and leaders in emergencies. That requires a lot of conversation. We ourselves, in the Istanbul conference, instead of bringing a big ActionAid delegation, what we've done was to bring a number of women first respondents, those that I just told the stories, to come to the summit. And they have had a good impact on talking to people, but not as much impact on the results of the conference, unfortunately. So we would say, for instance, there has been quite a lot of commitments, at least 54 big commitments, but they are gender blind. And it's tough to say, but it's true. There is no sufficient understanding of the need not only to talk about localization, but talk about women's rights and women leadership on response. One example of being gender blind is the one that is in there. So we say that 25% is going to go to the local organizations. Why not to say that half of it to women-led organizations or to women organizations, or create some sort of stronger commitment? So my point is we have done a good step forward in terms of understanding the needs to localizing response, as well as localizing, by definition, preparedness. However, we have not done enough in terms of commitments to not only localize, but ensure a priority for women's rights and women-led organizations. And we believe that's an opportunity for us to continue doing that in many ways, and that's what will be my final points. What can we do to address that gap? So, sorry, that's not me. That was someone else. So just to say, first of all, now the Grand Bargain has a good political momentum. There is increased number of signatory states coming into the process in the next phase of implementation until June 2018. And there will be a number of projects being piloted at field level as part of the Great Bargain. So what can we do to make sure that those pilots fully take into consideration that gap, the gender blind commitments, and the need to increase our focus and our relationship with local women's groups and women's movements? So that's a first opportunity. When we pilot, we do have to bring women's rights much closer to our action. Second one is that on the implementation phase, in this next implementation phase, ensure the participation and engagement of women and women's organizations from crisis affected countries in the pilot. It's not only about when you do the pilot, you involve women. It's how on designing the pilot, we actually invite women that have had that experience in so many countries to help us to shape and format. The third opportunity for us is that we have to take some concrete and clear and strong measures to ensure the participation and engagement of women and local women NGOs in humanitarian preparedness and response coordination. There are opportunities for that, not only in terms of increasing the money that can be supporting those organizations, but more importantly, engaging them on the national funding mechanisms. Many governments in the world, particularly now with climate change and the rise on emergencies, are developing new systems, new policies, new procedures to preparedness and response. So to what extent are we ensuring that the women's movements are reshaping that with the governments? And also in terms of localization. So we have an example that through the START network funded by DFID, we on DRC have a good success story that the representative of NGOs on formatting the policies for emergency response in DRC is actually a national organization. So that kind of mindset change, instead of bringing international NGOs to do that. We also have to get, and that's the fourth opportunity as international NGO, we need to get our house on order. And there are issues here that we have to be open about it. How many women hold leadership positions on humanitarian responsibility on international NGO? On each one of us, and that's a self-critique, ActionAid included. To what extent are we making a deliberate effort to ensure that the leadership in organizations change, that at local level, the program officers responsible for that, we increase the participation of women? There is a fundamental gender imbalance. If you look at organizations, international NGOs, men and women positions, in particular positions in power, in relation to humanitarian, you're going to have a fundamental gap. And that's on our hands. That's on no one else's hand. We cannot blame anyone for that. That's about us, our own decisions, our own systems, our own incentives. So I think I would like to invite all of us to really commit, as we did in Istanbul, that at least 50% of the leadership positions in humanitarian contexts are held by women by 2020. That requires change on HR policies. That requires change on how we recruit. And I think we have to walk the talk. And finally, I also would like to say and take the opportunity that we have colleagues from ActionAid with us, that multi-year sustainable investment on local and national responders is absolutely fundamental. And we don't have that as well, because 80% goes to a very, very small club. So trying to change the mindset on how we really create a possibility of long-term investment and support to national groups and to women's groups in particular is fundamental. And I'll finish just by saying something that it looks like it's two parallel worlds. So if you look at the world of feminism and women's rights and the world of humanitarian, what is the bridge? And to what extent can we create a space for a very productive dialogue of those two very different sets of agendas and proposals? Because if we don't do, I don't believe that by ourselves we will create a greater opportunity. The only way for us as a sector to change the approach and to have a much stronger participation of women and a much stronger women-shaped agenda is if we create space through which the women's movements themselves will reshape ourselves. And I think that's also up to us to have that openness and to create the space and the bridge for a fundamental change that's required. So thank you very much, and I hope my Brazilian accent did not fundamentally compromise my ability to communicate. Thank you very much.